Hello, I'm Ted Schwaba, a postdoc at UT Austin. Today I'm going to be talking about what is perhaps the weirdest trait in the world, openness to experience. Openness to experience is the fifth of the big five personality domains. It's the last one to emerge in a factor analysis. I think the trait is well captured by this fresco, The School of Athens. People who score high on openness tend to be creative, intellectual thinkers. They're curious, they reflexively engage with art and literature, and they're unconventional and a little bit weird, too. But there's another important way in which openness is weird. This 2010 paper by Henrik, Heine, and Noren Zion is probably one of the most influential scientific papers of the decade. In it, the authors describe how a majority of psychology research is done on people who are born and raised in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic contexts, which, as they note, is a particularly thin and rather unusual slice of humanity. Of course, there's nothing weird or wrong, a priori, with studying this group. The issue is that conclusions made using weird subjects are often presumed to be normative, universal conclusions that generalize to all of humanity. Though Henrik and colleagues do not discuss personality traits in this paper, it's clear that much of the research that has led to current paradigmatic views on personality structure was also done on weird samples, with the hope that these structures would generalize to the rest of humanity. I'd like to highlight a few scale development samples in particular. The Eugene Springfield Community Sample, which has been an enormously influential sample in terms of personality structure and scale creation. Some of the most commonly used personality inventories today, such as the IPIP scales and the Big Five aspect scales, were developed in part using this sample. And this sample is quite weird. Similarly, the Big Five inventory and its sequel, the BFI2, were developed in part using undergraduates from UC Berkeley. Early research that led to the eventual Hexaco inventory was done primarily using Canadian undergraduates. And finally, the validation and norming samples for the Neo-PIR come from a well-educated sample that is otherwise representative of the 1984 US. However, the 1984 US was much less racially diverse and ethnically diverse than today's United States. A rather ironic quote found on some old Neo-PIR reports is that it's based on research using normal, in this context, as opposed to clinical adult samples. But compared to the rest of the world, each of these samples are quite weird. In these Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples, openness emerges as an important and coherent individual difference in personality. One method of investigating the universality of trait structure is to translate scales developed in one cultural context and test how they fare in other contexts. This is called the ARP approach. One of my favorite studies that tested personality scales using the ARP approach is Church and colleagues from 2011. They compared Neo-PIR translations across college students in the US, Philippines, and Mexico. Because all participants in these samples were college students, they're all somewhat weird to begin with. The first rough indication that openness might not function so well in these other cultural contexts is that the items don't intercorrelate so strongly in the Filipino and Mexico samples. You can see this with the Chromebox alpha across the openness scales. The second is that the majority of openness items failed measurement and variance tests. Either the correlations between the items differed across samples, or the average item scores net of the latent factor did. The authors noted that across all 30 Neo facets, the openness facets of openness to values and openness to actions showed the most consistent pattern of differential functioning. These ones performed the worst across groups. In other words, these two facets, along with the straightforwardness facet of agreeableness, were the least cross-culturally invariant. This similar pattern was found among samples of Chinese college students who completed a translated Neo-PIR, and also among French-speaking Africans. Openness scales in these two cultural contexts were more weakly intercorrelated than other Big Five traits, and the facets of values and actions, again, along with ideas, didn't load on a common openness factor. I think that these examples give a pretty representative summary of the rest of the literature as well, which is that openness measures perform quite differently once they've been exported outside the weird contexts in which they were developed. Compared to the other Big Five traits, they're less strongly intercorrelated, and many items function differently. A second, less colonial approach to understanding personality structure is to derive structures using a given culture's own language. This emic approach yields an emergent structure that can then be compared to the Big Five. The results of this research have supported some amount of broad pan-cultural agreement for 4 of the Big Five, but that does not really extend to openness. An openness-like factor did not emerge in bottom-up lexical studies in South Africa across 11 different languages, across mainland China and Hong Kong, in any of the 3 major African language groups, or in Arabic speakers in the Levant. Words relating to individual differences in the weird concept of openness were less common in these languages, and furthermore, the trait items that did exist didn't separate out into a distinct factor. This continues a long history of problems with openness across lexical studies. As early as 1994, Durad was writing about lexical studies of other European nations and said, none of the nominated 5th factors has both proceeded from the lexical method and received unquestionable cross-cultural affirmation. The differences he was concerned with about intellect versus unconventionality pale in comparison to these more recent studies that often lack openness entirely. As a pretty fun exercise, you can go to almost any lexical study of personality traits, Control+F, look up openness, and you'll find a paragraph of disappointment in the discussion section. Oh no! Do these failures of both the etic and emic approach to identify openness, are they that disappointing? If the goal is to identify a universal human personality trait structure, it seems like they are. It appears that openness, as derived in weird inventories, is not a universally relevant trait. Is everything lost, and should we just focus on the other Big Five? Because those are more cross-culturally consistent. Well, I don't see much of a reason to despair. Oh yes, we just need to reframe our thinking. Understanding this variation across cultures can help enrich our understanding of individual differences and the human condition more broadly. I think it can bring us from the more intractable question of what traits exist, because that's not really a good one to answer, to a more nuanced perspective. Why are certain traits more relevant in certain cultural contexts? So Amber Tallmeyer, my collaborator, and I, we hypothesize that openness is uniquely relevant in individualistic cultural contexts. So, what does individualism have to do with openness? We define individualism as the extent to which a culture emphasizes independence and self-reliance. The low pole of individualism is collectivism, the extent to which a culture emphasizes interdependence between people. We believe that individualism may make individual differences and openness especially salient, facilitating use of this trait and its inclusion into the language. According to the lexical hypothesis, an individual difference becomes coded into language to the extent that it is useful to describe people. As individualism grants people license to act in accordance with their inner desires and goals versus those of a group, it is valuable in these cultures to come up with words like creative, quirky, and thoughtful because they differentiate those who score high on this trait from those who score low on it. In this way, individualism may promote openness-relevant language. In contrast, individual differences in a person's tendency to be curious and unconventional may be more restricted in collectivistic contexts, which tend to place a greater extent on the emphasis of conformity and conventionality than individualistic cultural contexts. In these more collective cultural contexts, clear expectations for behavior might make individual differences in openness less relevant and useful to describe people, and thus this would make openness-related terms less likely to be incorporated into everyday trait language. Niche diversity theory might also explain why openness is especially relevant in individualistic societies. This theory states that societies with a greater number of roles for a person to select into will produce a more complex emergent system of personality traits. In other words, in individualistic cultures that have many niches, openness is an important individual difference that people use to sort themselves and others into jobs, hobbies, and relationships based on variation in intellect, values, and artistic preferences, for example. In a less individualistic society, where people sort into niches based more on tradition and on agreement than on a person's individualistic desires, individual differences in openness might matter a little bit less. As an anecdotal example, Senufo people are well known for their masks and painting, but these trades are generally passed down through family lines. So even if these skills are valued, individual differences in aesthetic preferences and aesthetic ability aren't especially relevant in Sinufo society. Overall, this may help explain the discrepancy between lexical studies in weird societies versus other languages. Openness may be a less important individual difference in collectivistic cultures. A second major intersection between openness and individualism is that individualism may support a particular configuration of openness. Recall that in past EDIC research, some of the neo-PIR facets of openness that fit most poorly in translated inventories tended to be values and openness to action. Items from these facets didn't fit so well in other cultural contexts. We hypothesized that maybe these facets are more strongly tied to other openness-related traits in individualistic societies, and they're less highly correlated in collectivistic societies. So here's a cross-sectional network graph of correlations between 76 openness-related facets that were measured in the very weird Eugene Springfield community sample. In this network, more strongly correlated facets are placed closer to one another, and uncorrelated facets repel one another. You can see in this network that facets related to values, such as flexibility and traditionalism, cluster together with one another, and they're also kind of in the core of openness, clustered with many other facets. The same can be seen with facets related to actions. In more collectivistic societies, these facets may be less strongly tied to the rest of the openness network. In a network model, for example, they might appear at the fringes, so the outside of this figure, or in their own little subclusters. The logic behind this clustering is that in an individualistic society, there may be a tighter causal connection between individual differences in openness and a person's emergent unconventionality, intellectualism, value systems, and exploratory tendencies. In individualistic cultures, people are encouraged to choose their own adventure. Someone who is unconventional and intellectual may, based off these traits, reject tradition and choose a more progressive political ideology. But in a collective society, people may be encouraged to adopt the political and religious beliefs of their more immediate cultural contexts. That is, in a collectivistic society, there's less of a reason for a person's unconventionality to be tied to their intellectualism and preference for novelty. This is similar with openness to actions, also known as behavioral exploration. In an individualistic society, whether a person explores new places and tries new food may be more a function of their personal attributes rather than their circumstances. Overall, we think this might help explain why translated openness scales tend to function differently across cultures. Individualism supports a particular configuration of traits that we call openness, and in less weird contexts, there may be less of a reason for some of these openness content traits to hang together with the rest of the trait. So, now looking at O across the universe, a final caveat that I'd like to add about some parts of openness that might be rather universal and across different societies and cultural contexts. So researchers have found that the tendency to experience aesthetic chills seems to be a cross-cultural universal, and it seems in every culture that people have measured it that it's very strongly related to openness to experience across a variety of translated inventories. Similar research has found that people who can voluntarily control their goosebumps tend to score extremely high on openness, with Cohen's d of 0.9. This connection between openness and a set of individual differences that is more biologically based and less culturally contextualized suggests a core feature of personality that might serve as a biological anchor for a universal conception of some openness-like trait. Furthermore, Thalmeier and colleagues, when interviewing Namibian Kwekwe speakers, asked them, in Kwekwe, do you know anyone who tends to think things out or tends to come up with ideas? Though Kwekwe doesn't contain many words related to openness, people interviewed could generally describe a person who fits this phrase, and in their responses they often describe people who embody core concepts of openness. So that is, they describe people that are artistically inventive and people who are intellectual. You can pause to read these quotes. These findings suggest that even in cultures where openness might not be especially relevant, it's still an individual difference that people can identify when they specifically seek it out and try to describe it. So, is openness the weirdest trait in the world? Well, it's certainly the weirdest of the big five. EDIC methods of translating openness scales find that they perform quite differently in non-weird samples. And EMIC methods of charting indigenous lexical structures rarely find that openness is an important individual difference. We hypothesize that this might be due, in part, to differences in individualism across cultural contexts. Openness is especially relevant in individualistic societies, and individualism may help explain why, in weird cultures, openness forms a particular configuration of thoughts, behaviors, and values. There might be a few universal elements of openness to experience, but I think our current paradigmatic understanding of openness is quite weird, and we need to become a little bit more flexible with our understanding of the trait. I also have a few practical takeaways. I think one of them is to be thoughtful when you're measuring openness. Common openness questionnaires ask about poetry and plays, about vacationing and art galleries. Make sure that the questions you're asking your participants are relevant to your sample. And when comparing across any sort of groups, run some tests to make sure that the group scores are actually comparable. Even if openness doesn't fit very well in one group or another, that's okay. It informs our theory about why certain individual differences matter in certain cultural contexts. Thank you.